Unaware of their 100 million inheritance, their uncles threw them out after their parents died. The eviction notice felt like sandpaper against Eve Williams' trembling fingers as she stared at the bold red letters. Final notice, 72 hours to vacate. Behind her, 9-year-old Marcus sobbed into his tattered backpack while 12-year-old Daniel tried to comfort 6-year-old Jordan, whose fever had spiked again during the night. The cramped motel room that had been their home for 3 weeks reeked of mold and desperation, and now even this refuge was being ripped away. Eve. Daniel's voice cracked with the weight of trying to be the man he wasn't ready to become. What are we gonna do? She couldn't answer. Not yet. Not when her throat felt like it was closing and her chest burned with the kind of rage that could consume everything in its path. 6 months ago, they'd been a family of 6 living in their parents' beautiful colonial home in Atlanta's affluent Buckhead district. Now they were 4 orphaned children with exactly $17.32 between them, abandoned by every blood relative who'd once claimed to love them. Hey beautiful souls, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing amazing today, and I have to ask, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments because I love connecting with my incredible viewers from all corners of the globe. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button right now because you're about to witness a story that will completely shatter your heart and then piece it back together in the most unexpected way. The memory hit Eve like a physical blow. Uncle Samuel and Uncle Jerome standing in their childhood living room just 3 days after the funeral. Their faces masks of false sympathy while their eyes calculated the worth of every piece of furniture, every family photograph, every trace of the life their parents had built. You'll understand this is for the best, Uncle Samuel had said, his gold tooth catching the light as he smiled that snake oil grin Eve had always hated. 4 kids is too much responsibility for anyone to handle. We'll make sure you're taken care of. But the house, well, your daddy had debts, baby girl. Lots of debts. Lies. All of it had been lies. Eve's mother, Patricia Williams, had been a successful real estate attorney. Her father, David Williams, owned 3 thriving auto repair shops across the city. There were no debts. There had never been any debts. But Eve had been 18 and drowning in grief, and her brothers had been children who didn't understand why strangers were boxing up their mother's jewelry and their father's tools. Sign here. Uncle Jerome had thrust papers at her with hands that shook from either guilt or eagerness. Eve still couldn't tell which. This transfers guardianship to us temporarily while we sort everything out. Just until you're back on your feet. She should have read those documents. Should have demanded a lawyer. Should have fought harder. But Marcus had been screaming for their mother every night, and Jordan had stopped eating. And Daniel had started having panic attacks that left him gasping on the bathroom floor. Eve had been trying to hold her brothers together while her own world crumbled, and she'd trusted the 2 men who'd bounced her on their knees when she was little. The biggest mistake of her life. Within a week, they'd been informed that the house was being sold to pay off debts. Within 2 weeks, they'd been moved to a rundown apartment in East Atlanta. Within a month, that apartment had been deemed too expensive, and they'd been relocated to an even smaller place. Each move stripped away more of their belongings, more of their dignity, more of their hope. Your daddy's business accounts were cleaned out, Uncle Samuel had explained during one of his increasingly rare visits. Bad investments. Real bad investments. We're doing our best, but... More lies. Eve knew it in her bones, but proving it was another matter entirely. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago when Eve discovered that both uncles had purchased new cars, a gleaming Mercedes for Samuel and a loaded pickup truck for Jerome. When she'd confronted them, Uncle Jerome's mask had finally slipped. You need to learn gratitude, little girl, he'd snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and cigarettes. We didn't have to take you all in at all. Your daddy was always too proud for his own good, and look where it got him. Dead at 38 with nothing to show for it. That's not true, Eve had whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of blood in her ears. Ain't it? Uncle Samuel had laughed, the sound like broken glass. Then where's all that money he was always bragging about? Where are all them investments and savings accounts he claimed to have? Face reality, Eve. Your daddy was a dreamer and a fool, and now you all are paying the price. That night, they'd been given another ultimatum, accept being split up into different foster homes, or figure out how to survive on their own. Eve had chosen the impossible over the unthinkable, gathering her brothers and what little they had left, and walking away from the only family they'd ever known. Now, staring at this eviction notice while her youngest brother burned with fever and her middle brothers tried not to cry, Eve felt something crystallize in her chest. Not hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But determination. Cold, hard, unbreakable determination. Her parents hadn't been fools. They'd been planners, savers, people who'd talked about college funds and retirement accounts and leaving something behind for their children. There had to be something her uncles didn't know about. Something they hadn't found. Something that could save them all. Eve folded the eviction notice carefully and slipped it into her back pocket. When she turned to face her brothers, her voice was steady for the first time in months. "Pack everything. We're leaving tonight." "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his 9-year-old face streaked with tears and snot. Eve looked out the grimy motel window at the city lights twinkling in the distance like stars she could no longer reach. Somewhere out there, in a world that had turned its back on them, lay the truth about what their parents had really left behind. And she was going to find it, no matter what it took. "We're going home," she said quietly. "We're going to find out what Uncle Samuel and Uncle Jerome don't want us to know." But as the words left her lips, Eve had no idea that the truth she was so desperate to uncover would be more shocking than anything she could possibly imagine. Hidden in the depths of her father's past was a secret so explosive, so life-changing, that it would transform them from 4 homeless orphans into the inheritors of a fortune that would make their uncle's betrayal look like pocket change. The real question wasn't whether they'd survive the streets. It was whether they'd survive the truth. What do you think Eve and her brothers are going to discover? Have you ever been betrayed by family members you trusted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories always inspire me to keep bringing you these powerful narratives. The abandoned storage unit in Decatur had been their father's best-kept secret, and Eve only remembered it because she'd been with him the day he'd renewed the lease 2 years ago. Just some old business records, baby girl. He'd told her with that mysterious smile that meant he knew more than he was saying. Nothing important. But as Eve used the key she'd found hidden in her mother's jewelry box, the only piece of jewelry the uncles hadn't managed to lose, she realized that David Williams had been preparing for something. The unit was organized with military precision, boxes labeled by year, file folders arranged alphabetically, and in the back corner, a fireproof safe that made Eve's heart race. "Daddy really kept all this stuff?" Daniel whispered, running his fingers along the neat rows of documents. At 12, he had their father's analytical mind and their mother's attention to detail. If anyone could help her make sense of this paper trail, it would be him. Marcus, despite his fever breaking that morning, was curled up on an old blanket Eve had spread in the corner, clutching the stuffed elephant their mother had bought him for his last birthday. At 9, he was the family comedian, always trying to make everyone laugh even when his own heart was breaking. But tonight, he was just a scared little boy who missed his parents with every breath. Jordan, at 6, had the family gift for numbers that had skipped Eve entirely. He was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, counting and recounting the coins they'd scraped together, arranging them in perfect stacks while humming the lullaby their mother used to sing. The child who'd once chatted non-stop had barely spoken above a whisper since the funeral, but his silence held its own kind of strength. "Eve," Daniel's voice was tight with excitement and fear. "You need to see this." She abandoned the safe combination she'd been trying. Their parents' anniversary date, each child's birthday, every significant number she could remember, and joined Daniel at a banker's box marked Insurance, Personal. Inside were policies Eve had never heard of. Life insurance, yes, but amounts that made her dizzy. Disability insurance for both parents. And then, buried beneath certificates and legal documents, a letter in their father's careful handwriting addressed to "My children, when you're old enough to understand." Eve's hands shook as she unfolded it. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind their father had used for important business correspondence. "My precious children, if you're reading this, then Patricia and I are gone, and you found yourselves in circumstances I pray you'll never face. But I'm your father, and it's my job to protect you even when I can't be there to do it myself. Eve, my strong girl, you're probably trying to take care of everyone else while your world falls apart. Daniel, son, you're probably trying to figure out how to fix things with logic and planning. Marcus, my little comedian, you're probably making everyone laugh while hiding your own tears. And Jordan, my quiet genius, you're probably watching and learning, seeing more than anyone realizes. I know my brothers. I love them, but I know them. If something happens to your mother and me, they'll see $signs, not grandchildren. They'll tell you there's nothing left, that I was irresponsible, that I left you with nothing but debt and broken dreams. They are wrong. 23 years ago, before I met your mother, I made a mistake that changed my life forever. I was young, angry, and stupid, and I got involved with people I shouldn't have trusted. Without going into details that might hurt you someday, I found myself in possession of something that didn't belong to me. Something valuable. Instead of returning it or turning it over to the police like I should have, I hid it. I told myself I'd figure out what to do later, when I wasn't scared and desperate. But later never came. I met your mother, fell in love, started a family, and built a life. The secret stayed buried, and with each passing year, it became harder to unearth. But secrets have a way of growing in the dark, children. What I took has grown into something I never imagined. Something that will ensure you never want for anything, never have to beg family members for help, never have to choose between food and shelter. The combination to the safe is your mother's maiden name followed by the year we were married, Johnson 1998. Inside, you'll find account numbers, passwords, and instructions that will lead you to a fortune I've spent 20 years legitimizing through investments, business ventures, and careful planning. Every penny clean, every dollar legally yours. But more than the money, you'll find proof of who your parents really were. Not the failures your uncles will paint us as, but people who loved you enough to plan for every contingency, including our own deaths. Eve, protect your brothers. They'll try to split you up, convince you that you can't handle the responsibility. Prove them wrong. Daniel, use that brilliant mind of yours. Question everything. Trust no one until they've earned it. Marcus, keep making people smile. The world needs your light, especially when things get dark. Jordan, speak up when it matters. Your voice may be quiet, but your words carry power. And all of you, remember that being family isn't about sharing blood. It's about choosing to love someone no matter what. You four have that bond. Don't let anyone break it. The papers in the safe will lead you to Thomas Chen, an attorney in Midtown who's been handling certain aspects of my affairs for years. He doesn't know about you children, but when you show him the documents, he'll understand. He'll help you claim what's rightfully yours. I love you all more than words can express. Your mother and I may not be there to guide you through what comes next, but we've given you everything you need to not just survive, but thrive. Make us proud. All my love, Daddy. P.S. The storage unit is paid up for the next 5 years. If you need a safe place to think and plan, this is it. Eve's tears fell freely now, splashing onto the letter as she read it aloud to her brothers. Marcus had stopped pretending to sleep and was staring at her with wide eyes. Daniel was already moving toward the safe, his fingers working the combination lock with steady determination. Jordan had abandoned his coin counting and crawled over to lean against Eve's side. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the storage unit like a gunshot. Inside were stacks of documents, USB drives, and a leather portfolio that practically hummed with importance. But it was the bank statements that made Eve's knees buckle. Account balances with so many zeros she had to count them twice. Investment portfolios worth millions. Properties she'd never heard of in states she'd never visited. And at the bottom of the pile, a deed to a house in Marietta, a house that had been sitting empty for 3 years, fully paid for, waiting for the day when it might be needed. Eve, Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. We're not poor. No, she breathed, staring at numbers that represented more money than she'd ever imagined existed. We're not poor at all. Marcus sat up straighter, fever forgotten. Does this mean we don't have to go to foster homes? Jordan spoke for the first time in days, his small voice carrying absolute certainty. It means Uncle Samuel and Uncle Jerome are going to be very, very sorry. But even as relief and excitement coursed through her veins, Eve felt a chill of apprehension. Her father's letter had mentioned mistakes, dangerous people, secrets buried in the past. This money hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It had a history, a story that might come back to haunt them. Still, looking at her brothers' faces, hope replacing despair, strength replacing weakness, Eve made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, they would contact Thomas Chen. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of claiming their inheritance. Tomorrow, they would start the journey from victims to victors. But tonight, they would sleep in their father's safe house, surrounded by proof that they were loved, protected, and provided for even beyond the grave. Uncle Samuel and Uncle Jerome had stolen 6 months of their lives. Eve was about to make sure they paid for every single day. Thomas Chen's law office occupied the entire 42nd floor of one of Midtown Atlanta's gleaming towers, and as Eve stood in the marble lobby holding a folder full of documents that could change their lives forever, she felt like an imposter. Her jeans were clean but worn, her jacket borrowed from a shelter donation box, and her brothers looked like what they were, children who'd been living on the streets for months. The security guard had already asked them twice if they were lost or looking for someone, his tone suggesting they didn't belong in a building where the elevator buttons were made of actual gold. But the documents in Eve's folder had gotten them past the front desk, and Thomas Chen himself had agreed to see them immediately. William's children, he'd said over the phone, and she could hear the sharp intake of breath. Come up right now. Don't speak to anyone else. Don't mention why you're here. Just come straight to my office. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. Daniel pressed his face to the glass wall, watching the city shrink below them while Marcus held Jordan's hand and whispered jokes that made their baby brother actually giggle. For the first time in months, they looked like children instead of refugees. Thomas Chen was nothing like Eve had expected. Instead of the elderly white man she'd pictured, he was young, maybe 35, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that shifted from curiosity to shock to something that looked almost like fear as he examined their father's documents. Sit down, he said quietly, gesturing to a conference table that could have seated 20 people. All of you. We need to talk. For 10 minutes, he read in absolute silence while Eve's heart hammered against her ribs. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta spread out like a promise of possibilities. But inside this office, the future hung in the balance of whatever Thomas Chen was thinking. Finally, he looked up. How long has your father been gone? 6 months, Eve answered. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. And your uncles? Samuel and Jerome Williams. They've been acting as your guardians. They threw us out 2 weeks ago, Daniel said with the bluntness that only 12-year-olds could manage. Said we could go to foster care or figure it out ourselves. Thomas Chen's jaw tightened. They told you there was no money, no inheritance. They said Daddy had debts, Marcus chimed in. Said he was irresponsible and left us with nothing. For a moment, Thomas Chen just stared at them. Then he laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter irony that comes from watching terrible people do predictably terrible things. Your father, he said slowly, was one of the most financially responsible men I've ever known. He spent 23 years turning a single mistake into a legitimate fortune, and every penny of it belongs to you. He stood and walked to a wall safe Eve hadn't even noticed, punching in a code with fingers that trembled slightly. When he turned back, he was holding a thick folder marked Williams Trust, Confidential. 23 years ago, your father came to me with a problem. He'd found himself in possession of a collection of stolen art, paintings, sculptures, jewelry that had been taken from a private collector during a home invasion. The thieves who'd hired him to transport the pieces had been arrested, but they didn't know David had kept detailed records of everything. Eve's stomach dropped. Our father was a criminal. Your father was 19 years old and desperate, Thomas Chen corrected gently. He was supposed to drive a truck from one location to another, no questions asked. When he realized what he was transporting, he panicked. Instead of turning the items over to the police and risking prosecution, he hid them and came to me. He opened the folder, revealing photographs of artwork that took Eve's breath away. Paintings she recognized from art history classes, sculptures that belonged in museums, jewelry that sparkled even in two-dimensional images. We spent 3 years researching the provenance of every piece. The original owner had died in the robbery, a reclusive collector named Harrison Montgomery who'd made his fortune in tech during the early days of the internet. He had no living relatives, no heirs, and according to his will, his entire estate was to be donated to various charities upon his death. So the art legally belonged to the charities? Daniel asked, his quick mind already working through the implications. Exactly. But the charities couldn't claim what they didn't know existed. The stolen pieces weren't included in the official inventory of Montgomery's estate because they'd been taken before the will could be executed. Thomas Chen pulled out another set of documents, legal papers covered in signatures and official seals. Your father and I spent 5 years quietly returning every single piece to its rightful place. Anonymous donations to the museums and organizations Montgomery had named in his will. But Montgomery's estate was so vast, and the donations came in so gradually, that they also included a reward fund for anyone who helped recover the stolen items. He felt like the room was spinning. A reward fund. 15% of the estimated value of any recovered pieces, paid out over time to avoid tax complications and maintain anonymity. Your father didn't want money for what he'd done. He wanted to make things right. But the law is the law, and the estate insisted on paying the reward. He slid a calculator across the table and showed them numbers that made Jordan gasp out loud. The art collection was valued at $875 million. 15% of that, invested carefully over 23 years. He paused for effect. Your current inheritance, including all investment growth, property acquisitions, and business ventures your father used to legitimize the funds, is worth approximately $157 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Eve could hear her own heartbeat, her brother's breathing, the hum of the air conditioning 42 floors above the city that had nearly destroyed them. 157 million, she whispered. And growing every day. Your father was a genius with investments, and I've been managing the portfolio according to his instructions since before you were born. You're not just wealthy, children. You're generationally wealthy. Your great-great-grandchildren will never want for anything. Marcus started crying, not from sadness this time, but from relief so profound it shook his entire body. Daniel was staring at the numbers like they might disappear if he blinked. Jordan was counting on his fingers, trying to process what 157 million actually meant. But Eve felt something else entirely. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage that burned away 6 months of fear and desperation, and replaced it with something far more dangerous. Our uncles knew, she said quietly. They had to know. Thomas Chen's expression darkened. The trust was set up to be triggered by your father's death and accessed when the oldest child turned 18. Your uncles, as next of kin, would have been contacted by my office within days of the funeral. I sent certified letters explaining that they needed to bring you children to my office to begin the inheritance process. They never said anything, Daniel breathed. They never brought us anywhere. Because they were hoping you'd disappear into the foster system before you could find out the truth. If you'd aged out of the system without ever claiming your inheritance, it would have eventually reverted to your father's estate, which they stood to inherit as his brothers. Eve stood up so fast her chair toppled backward. They've been stealing from us for 6 months. They threw us out in the street, let us sleep in shelters and alleys and cheap motels, let Jordan get sick and Marcus go hungry and Daniel have panic attacks, all while knowing we were millionaires. 157 times over, Thomas Chen confirmed grimly. For a moment, Eve couldn't speak. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took her breath away. Then she looked at her brothers, Marcus wiping tears on his sleeve, Daniel staring at legal documents that proved they'd never have to be afraid again, Jordan quietly asking if they could afford food now, and the rage crystallized into something harder than diamond. I want them arrested, she said. For what? Technically, they haven't committed any crimes. Morally reprehensible, yes, but legally. Then I want them destroyed, Eve said with a calm that surprised even her. I want them to understand exactly what they've done, and I want them to pay for every single day they left us on the streets. Thomas Chen smiled, and for the first time since they'd entered his office, he looked truly pleased. Now you sound like your father's daughter, he said. He left very specific instructions for this exact scenario. Would you like to hear them? Outside the windows, Atlanta glittered in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities that had been theirs all along. But inside this office, 4 orphaned children were about to become 4 of the wealthiest people in Georgia. And their uncles, the men who'd stolen their childhood, their security, their trust, were about to learn that some betrayals carry a price that compounds with interest. I can't believe the level of betrayal here. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your understanding of a situation? Let me know in the comments what you think should happen to those uncles. The plan David Williams had left for his children was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. For 3 days, Eve studied every document, every instruction, every carefully orchestrated step her father had designed to protect them from the very situation they now found themselves in. He knew, she whispered to Thomas Chen during their second meeting, this time held in the penthouse suite of a downtown hotel that their trust owned outright. He knew exactly what Samuel and Jerome would do. Your father understood his brothers better than they understood themselves, Thomas agreed, spreading out a series of legal documents across the marble coffee table. Samuel's gambling addiction, Jerome's drinking problem, their jealousy of his success, he factored it all into his contingency planning. The hotel suite had become their temporary home while Thomas Chen's team worked to establish their new identities as the Williams heirs. For the first time in months, Marcus was sleeping in an actual bed instead of on floors or benches. Daniel had access to a computer and internet, diving deep into research about their father's business empire. Jordan had discovered room service and was systematically working his way through every dessert on the menu. But Eve couldn't rest. Not yet. Phase 1 begins tomorrow, she announced, studying the surveillance photos that Thomas's private investigator had delivered that morning. Samuel's at the casino every Tuesday night, and Jerome's at Murphy's Tavern by 9 p.m. They follow the same routine every week. The photos showed her uncles living well on money that should have fed, housed, and educated their nephews. Samuel's new Mercedes was parked outside the Grand Palace Casino, while Jerome's truck sat in the parking lot of a bar known for its expensive whiskey and loose morals. Both men looked relaxed, happy, completely free of guilt over 4 children they'd abandoned to the streets. "You don't have to do this personally," Thomas warned. "We could handle everything through lawyers, investigators, the proper channels." "No," Eve said firmly. "This is personal. They need to see our faces when their world falls apart." Marcus looked up from the video game he'd been playing on the suite's massive television. "Are we really going to make them pay, Eve?" "We're going to make them understand," she corrected. "There's a difference between revenge and justice. Daddy taught us the difference, even if we didn't realize it at the time." That evening, Eve stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized herself. The girl who'd worn the same 3 outfits for months was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she belonged in a lawyer's office or boardroom. The personal shopper Thomas had hired had chosen clothes that were expensive but understated, the kind of wealth that whispered instead of shouted. Daniel emerged from the adjoining room wearing a suit that made him look older than his 12 years, while Marcus had been transformed from a street kid into someone who could have stepped out of a private school brochure. Jordan, in tiny dress pants and a button-down shirt, looked like a miniature businessman. "We look like rich people," Marcus observed with wonder. "We are rich people," Daniel corrected. "We always were. We just didn't know it." The drive to Samuel's house took them through the neighborhood where they'd grown up, past the colonial home where they'd been happy before their world imploded. Eve stared at the sold sign in the front yard and felt that familiar burn of rage in her chest. "He sold our house for $2.3 million, she told her brothers. "The real estate records show he and Jerome split the profits 50-50. "While we were sleeping in a storage unit," Daniel added grimly. Samuel's new house was smaller but flashier, the kind of place someone bought when they wanted to look wealthy without actually understanding what wealth meant. The driveway was empty, confirming that he was at the casino, but lights were on inside, which meant his wife Rebecca was home. Rebecca Williams had always been kind to the children, bringing them cookies at Christmas and remembering their birthdays even when Samuel forgot. Eve had debated whether to include her in tonight's revelation, but ultimately decided that Rebecca deserved to know what kind of man she'd married. The doorbell chimed with an elaborate melody that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so tacky. When Rebecca opened the door, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, guilt, and finally something that looked like relief. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Eve. Daniel. Marcus. Jordan." Her eyes took in their transformed appearances, the expensive clothes, the confident way they carried themselves. You look healthy," Eve suggested with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well fed. Like we haven't been sleeping in abandoned buildings for the past 6 months." Rebecca's face crumpled. "Come in, please come in. I've been so worried. Samuel said you were being taken care of, that you were with a nice foster family." "Samuel lied," Daniel said simply. "About that and about everything else." They followed Rebecca into a living room that showcased everything wrong with new money. Leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars, a television the size of a small theater screen, art that had been chosen for its price tag rather than its beauty. But it was the framed photographs on the mantelpiece that made Eve's jaw clench. Pictures of Samuel and Jerome on vacation. Samuel grinning beside his new Mercedes. Jerome holding up a massive fish from some expensive fishing trip. Both men living their best lives while their nephews and niece scraped coins together for dollar store ramen. "Where did you think the money was coming from, Rebecca?" Eve asked quietly. "The new house, the new car, the trips to Miami and Las Vegas? Where did you think Samuel got the money for all of this?" Rebecca sank into one of the expensive chairs, and Eve could see the exact moment when the truth hit her. "The house," she whispered. "Your parents' house. He said there were debts, that selling it was the only way to provide for you children." "There were no debts," Marcus said, his 9-year-old voice carrying more authority than most adults could muster. "Our parents left us money. Lots and lots of money." "How much money?" Rebecca asked, though from her expression, she was beginning to suspect the answer would destroy her. Eve pulled out a single sheet of paper, a summary of their trust fund balance that Thomas Chen had prepared for exactly this moment. She placed it on the coffee table where Rebecca could see it clearly. The number was so large it took up most of the page. $157,382,847.93. Rebecca stared at it for a full minute before looking up with tears streaming down her face. 157 million. Plus interest, Jordan added helpfully. It goes up every day. Samuel knew, Rebecca said, and it wasn't a question. He knew when he sold your house, when he moved you to those apartments, when he... She stopped, covering her mouth with her hand. When he threw us out in the street. Eve finished. Yes, he knew. They both knew. They've been stealing from us for 6 months, hoping we'd disappear into the system before we could find out the truth. Rebecca stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the driveway where Samuel's Mercedes gleamed under the porch lights. What are you going to do? What our father planned for us to do, Eve said. Make sure they understand the consequences of their choices. As if summoned by their conversation, headlights swept across the front windows. Samuel's Mercedes pulled into the driveway, and even from inside the house, they could hear him laughing on his phone, probably bragging about his winnings at the casino. Rebecca, he called out as he entered the house. Baby, you should have seen me tonight. Hit 23 on the roulette wheel 3 times in a row. We're talking about that cruise to the Bahamas. He stopped dead when he saw them sitting in his living room. For a moment, nobody spoke. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, his phone still pressed to his ear, taking in the sight of 4 children he'd written off as someone else's problem. But these weren't the desperate, frightened kids he'd abandoned. These were young people who looked like they belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. I'll call you back, he said into his phone, never taking his eyes off Eve. Hello, Uncle Samuel, she said with perfect politeness. We need to talk. He looked at Rebecca, who was still standing by the window with tears on her cheeks, then back at the children he'd betrayed. What are you doing here? How did you? His eyes took in their clothes, their confidence, their complete transformation. Where did you get money for those outfits? Same place we got money for this, Daniel said, holding up the trust fund statement. Samuel's face went white, then gray, then a sickly green that suggested he might actually be sick right there on his expensive carpet. That's not possible, he whispered. $157 million, Marcus said cheerfully. Our daddy left it for us. You remember our daddy, right? Your brother. The one whose children you threw away like garbage. Samuel collapsed into the nearest chair, the trust fund statement shaking in his hands as he read it over and over. This has to be fake. David didn't have this kind of money. He couldn't have. Our father spent 23 years planning for every contingency, Eve said, including having brothers who would choose greed over family. The sound of another car in the driveway made them all turn toward the window. Jerome's truck was pulling up behind the Mercedes, which meant phase 2 of their father's plan was beginning right on schedule. You called Jerome? Samuel asked Rebecca with the desperation of a man watching his world collapse. I didn't call anyone, Rebecca whispered. Eve smiled, and this time it was genuine. We did. We told him you'd had a family emergency and needed him here immediately. He was very concerned about your welfare. The front door burst open without any pretense of knocking. Jerome Williams stumbled in, smelling like whiskey and looking like he'd driven straight from the bar to get here. Sammy, what's wrong? Rebecca said. He stopped when he saw the children, his alcohol-clouded brain taking several seconds to process their presence. What the hell are you kids doing here? Claiming our inheritance, Jordan said in his quiet, serious voice. Jerome laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the suddenly tense room. Inheritance? You're still playing make-believe? I thought the streets would have taught you better by now. Eve stood up slowly, and something in her posture made both men take a step backward. The streets taught us exactly what we needed to know, Uncle Jerome. They taught us who we could trust and who we couldn't. They taught us the difference between people who protect children and people who exploit them. And they taught us that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. She gestured to her brothers, who moved to stand beside her in a united front that neither Samuel nor Jerome could mistake. You chose greed over family, she continued. You chose luxury over the welfare of children who trusted you. You chose to steal from orphans rather than do the right thing. We didn't steal anything. Samuel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You stole 6 months of our childhood, Daniel said. You stole our sense of security, our trust in family, our belief that adults would protect us. You stole our house, Marcus added. Our parents' furniture, our mother's jewelry, our father's tools. You stole our future, Jordan finished. Or you tried to. Jerome was looking back and forth between his brother and the trust fund statement, his alcohol-fogged brain finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what he was seeing. 157 million? That's real. As real as the Mercedes in your driveway, Eve confirmed. As real as this house you bought with the money from selling our home. As real as every vacation you took while we slept on park benches. We were going to tell you, Samuel said weakly. We were just waiting for the right time. The right time was 6 months ago, Eve said. The right time was when you received the first letter from Thomas Chen's office explaining our inheritance. The right time was when you decided whether to be uncles or predators. Rebecca was crying openly now, staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Samuel, how could you? They are children. They are babies. They are millionaires, Jerome said, his voice filled with wonder and rage and something that might have been regret. David's kids are millionaires. 157 times over, Eve confirmed. And tomorrow morning, our lawyers will begin the process of recovering every penny you've stolen from us. The house sale, the furniture, the jewelry, all of it will be repaid with interest. You can't prove we stole anything, Samuel said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We don't have to prove it, Daniel said with a smile. We just have to ask for it back. You see, legally, you were acting as our guardians. Every asset of our parents' estate that you liquidated should have been held in trust for us until we came of age. Since you didn't do that, and since you used the money for your own benefit, it constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. Jerome stared at the 12-year-old who was calmly explaining how they were about to be legally destroyed. You can't know all that. You're just kids. We're kids with very expensive lawyers, Marcus said happily, and unlimited money to pay them. The room fell silent except for Rebecca's quiet sobbing and the sound of both men's worlds crashing down around them. Eve looked at her uncles, the men who'd bounced her on their knees when she was little, who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework, and felt nothing but pity. Our father left instructions for this exact situation, she said finally. He knew you'd choose money over family, and he planned accordingly. But he also left us a choice. Both men looked up with something that might have been hope. We can destroy you completely, Eve continued. Criminal charges for fraud and theft, civil suits that will take everything you own, public humiliation that will follow you for the rest of your lives. Oh, Samuel whispered. Or you can make this right. All of it. Every penny returned, every asset replaced, every wrong acknowledged. And in exchange, we'll let you walk away with your freedom and what's left of your dignity. What's the catch? Jerome asked suspiciously. Eve's smile was sharp as broken glass. No catch. Just consequences. You'll return everything you stole, pay penalties and interest, and then you'll disappear from our lives forever. No contact, no family gatherings, no attempts to reconcile. You'll live with what you did, and we'll live without you. And if we refuse? Samuel asked. Then our lawyers will be very, very busy, Daniel said. And very, very thorough. Outside, Atlanta glittered with the same possibilities it had always held. But inside this expensive house built on stolen dreams, two men were finally understanding the true cost of their betrayal. The children they'd thrown away had become the architects of their destruction. And the night was just getting started. The meeting Thomas Chen had arranged for the following morning took place in a conference room that looked like a courtroom designed by billionaires. 24 floors above the city, with windows offering a panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline, it was the kind of space where life-changing decisions were made with the stroke of a pen. Samuel and Jerome sat on one side of the massive mahogany table, flanked by the overpriced lawyers they'd hired with money that wasn't theirs. Both men looked like they'd aged a decade overnight. Samuel's usual confidence replaced by nervous fidgeting, Jerome's belligerent swagger reduced to hunched shoulders and darting eyes. On the other side sat the Williams children, Thomas Chen, and a team of attorneys that represented more combined legal firepower than most small countries could afford. The contrast was stark and intentional, predators versus protectors, thieves versus the rightful heirs. But it was the third party that made this meeting truly dangerous. Detective Maria Santos of the Atlanta Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit sat at the head of the table with a file folder that seemed to pulse with potential consequences. She'd been investigating the Williams estate since Thomas Chen had contacted the police about suspected guardianship fraud, and her expression suggested she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. Gentlemen, Thomas Chen began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd just spent 12 hours preparing for legal warfare. We're here to discuss the systematic theft of assets belonging to the Williams Trust. Assets that total, with interest and penalties, approximately $11.7 million. Samuel's lawyer, a nervous man named Peterson who clearly hadn't expected to be facing criminal charges when he'd taken this case, cleared his throat. My clients maintain that they acted within their legal rights as guardians of minor children. Any assets they liquidated were used for the children's care and... Stop! Detective Santos didn't raise her voice, but the single word cut through the room like a blade. Mr. Peterson, I'm going to save us all some time here. Your clients received certified letters from this law firm on 3 separate occasions, explaining that the Williams children had a substantial inheritance waiting to be claimed. Those letters were ignored. She opened her file folder and spread out photographs across the table, surveillance images that made both Samuel and Jerome shrink back in their seats. These photos show your clients at the Grand Palace Casino, Murphy's Tavern, a Mercedes dealership, and a luxury resort in Miami. All taken during the 6 months when they claimed to be barely managing to care for 4 orphaned children. She looked directly at Samuel. Tell me, Mr. Williams, how much did you spend on that roulette table last Tuesday night? Samuel's face went ashen. I don't remember exactly. $17,000, Detective Santos said flatly. In one evening, while your nephew was running a fever in a motel room that cost $19 a night. Jerome tried to interrupt. Now wait just a minute. We were never told these kids had any money. If we'd known. You'd have what? Detective Santos cut him off. Stolen it faster? More efficiently. She pulled out another document. These are bank records showing that you, Mr. Jerome Williams, deposited exactly half of the proceeds from the sale of your brother David's house into your personal account. $2.3 million, split 50-50 with your brother Samuel. That house had to be sold to pay debts, Samuel protested weakly. What debts? Thomas Chen asked. We've examined David Williams' financial records going back 15 years. He had no outstanding debts. His mortgage was paid off, his credit cards had 0 balances, and his business accounts were fully funded. So what debts, exactly, required you to sell his children's home? The silence stretched until it became suffocating. Eve watched her uncles squirm in their expensive suits bought with money that should have kept her brothers fed and housed, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. But here's what makes this case truly special, Detective Santos continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a death sentence. It's not just fraud or theft. It's something much worse. She pulled out a final document that made both defense lawyers go pale. Child endangerment, willful neglect of minors, conspiracy to defraud, and my personal favorite. She smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. Racketeering. Racketeering. Peterson stammered. That's organized crime charges. That's federal prison. That's exactly what it is, Detective Santos confirmed. You see, when 2 people conspire to systematically steal from children, when they forge documents to cover their tracks, when they engage in a pattern of criminal behavior designed to deprive minors of their inheritance, well, that falls under the RICO Act. Jerome's lawyer leaned over to whisper something urgent in his client's ear, but Jerome brushed him away. This is insane. We're family. We were trying to help. Help! Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the room, his 9-year-old voice carrying more moral authority than any adult in the room. You helped us learn what it feels like to be hungry. You helped us understand what it means to sleep on concrete. You helped us figure out who we could trust and who we couldn't. Daniel opened his tablet and pulled up a series of photographs that made Rebecca gasp from where she sat in the gallery behind the defendants. These are pictures of where we've been sleeping for the past 6 months. This one is behind a dumpster. This one is in an abandoned warehouse. This one is in a subway tunnel. And this, Jordan added quietly, holding up a hospital bracelet, is from when I got pneumonia because we couldn't afford proper shelter. The emergency room bill is $14,000. It's still unpaid because we had no insurance and no money. Eve watched her uncles stare at the evidence of what their greed had cost, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Our father knew this would happen, she said finally. He knew you'd choose money over family. That's why he left us instructions for exactly this situation. She nodded to Thomas Chen, who opened a sealed envelope that had been sitting on the table since the meeting began. This is David Williams' final message to his brothers, Thomas announced. Written 23 years ago, updated annually, and sealed with instructions to be opened only if his children were ever betrayed by family members. He cleared his throat and began to read. Samuel and Jerome, if you're hearing this, it means you've done exactly what I feared you would do. You've put money ahead of family, greed ahead of love, and your own comfort ahead of my children's welfare. I'm not surprised. Growing up, you both showed me who you really were. Samuel, you stole money from Mom's purse to buy comic books and blamed it on the neighbor kids. Jerome, you sold my baseball cards to buy cigarettes and told me they'd been lost. You were bullies, thieves, and cowards then, and apparently you still are now. But here's what you never understood about me. I kept records of everything. Every cruel thing you did, every lie you told, every time you chose the easy wrong over the difficult right. I documented it all because I knew that someday, it might matter. Today, it matters. The children sitting across from you are worth more money than you can imagine. More than enough to buy and sell you both 100 times over. They have the resources to destroy you completely, legally, financially, socially, and personally. But they also have something you never did, character. They will offer you a choice, just as I always offered you choices. You can make this right, return what you've stolen, accept the consequences of your actions, and disappear from their lives with whatever dignity you have left. Or you can fight, lie, make excuses, and blame everyone but yourselves. If you choose to fight, you will lose. Not because my children are vengeful, but because they are righteous. Justice has a way of finding people like you, Samuel and Jerome. It always has. The money you've stolen from my children amounts to a rounding error in their trust fund. But the pain you've caused them, the trauma you've inflicted, the childhood you've stolen, that debt can never be repaid. My children will grow up to be remarkable people despite what you've done to them. You will grow old knowing that when family needed you most, you chose money instead. That's your real inheritance, brothers. Live with it. David. The conference room fell silent except for the sound of Rebecca crying and Samuel's labored breathing. Jerome stared at his hands, his face a mask of shame and defiance warring with each other. So, Detective Santos said, closing her file folder with a snap that sounded like a cell door slamming. What's it going to be, gentlemen? Full restitution and a plea agreement? Or do we let a jury decide how they feel about adults who steal from orphan children? Samuel's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how long his clients would spend in federal prison if this went to trial. Jerome's attorney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. But it was Rebecca who broke the silence. Do it, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Give them back everything you stole. Every penny, every piece of furniture, every photograph, every memory you tried to take away from them. She stood up, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady. I won't be married to someone who steals from children. I won't live in a house built on stolen dreams. Samuel turned to stare at his wife with something approaching horror. Rebecca, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, she cut him off. You had a choice between doing right by 4 children who trusted you, or getting rich by betraying them. You chose money. You chose it every single day for 6 months while those babies were homeless and hungry and scared. She pulled off her wedding ring and set it on the table with a soft click that seemed to echo forever. I choose them. Eve felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. In a world where adults had repeatedly failed them, here was one person who'd chosen to do the right thing, even when it cost her everything. The full restitution package is $11.7 million, Thomas Chen announced. That includes the house sale proceeds, the liquidated assets, interest, penalties, and compensation for pain and suffering. You have 48 hours to arrange payment, or Detective Santos will proceed with criminal charges. 11.7 million. Jerome whispered. We don't have 11.7 million. Then you'll figure out how to get it, Eve said simply. Sell the Mercedes. Sell the house. Sell the truck. Liquidate your retirement accounts. Cash in your life insurance policies. Mortgage your souls if you have to. But you'll pay back every penny you stole from us, plus interest. And if we can't? Samuel asked. It's completely true. David Williams didn't just happen to find stolen art 23 years later. He was part of the crew that stole it in the first place. The only reason he wasn't arrested was because his partners were killed in a shootout with police before they could implicate him. The folder fell open, revealing crime scene photographs that made Marcus gasp and turn away. But Eve forced herself to look, forced herself to see the truth her father had hidden from them. My father was beaten to death during that robbery, Catherine continued. Tortured for the combination to his safe, then killed when he wouldn't give up the location of certain pieces. Your father watched it happen, participated in it. Then he stole the art and disappeared. No. Eve's voice was barely a whisper. Our father was a good man. He returned the art to museums. He kept the most valuable pieces for himself and returned the rest to cover his tracks, Catherine corrected. The Monet in your trust's art collection? That belonged to my father. The Picasso sketches, the Ming Dynasty vase, the Renaissance jewelry, all of it stolen from my father's private collection during the robbery that ended his life. Jordan dropped his flowers, the bright blooms scattering across their parents' graves like drops of blood. Eve, what is she talking about? But Eve couldn't answer. She was staring at documents that showed her father's fingerprints at the crime scene, witness statements placing him at the robbery, bank records showing suspicious deposits in the days following her father's murder. Of course, I can't prove any of this in court, Catherine continued conversationally. Too much time has passed, too many witnesses are dead, too much evidence has been compromised. But I don't need to prove it in court. She pulled out another document, a birth certificate, DNA test results, legal papers that made Eve's blood turn to ice. I need to prove it to the IRS. You see, your inheritance is based on found art being returned to rightful owners. But if that art was never actually lost, if it was always in the possession of the thief who stole it, then the finder's fees your father collected were obtained through fraud. What does that mean? Daniel asked, though Eve could see in his eyes that he already understood. It means your inheritance is built on blood money, Catherine said with satisfaction. It means every penny your father invested, every property he bought, every asset in your trust fund, all of it can be seized by the federal government as proceeds from criminal activity. Eve felt her knees buckle. The mansion, the cars, the security, the tutors, the future they'd been building, all of it was about to disappear. But I'm not unreasonable, Catherine continued. I didn't come here to destroy children for their father's crimes. I came here to make a deal. What kind of deal? Eve managed to ask. You sign over legal ownership of my father's art collection to me, the pieces your father never returned, the ones that form the core of your trust's value. In exchange, I don't file complaints with the IRS, the FBI, or the media about your father's true role in Harrison Montgomery's murder. Eve looked at her brothers, Marcus pale and shaking, Daniel calculating odds and outcomes, Jordan silent and staring at their parents' graves like he was trying to will their spirits to come back and explain everything. How much of our inheritance are you talking about? She asked. Catherine's smile widened. About 98% of it. The words hit like bullets. 98%. That would leave them with maybe $3 or $4 million, still wealthy by most standards, but not enough to maintain their new lifestyle, not enough to help other children the way they'd planned, not enough to build the kind of future their father had envisioned for them. And if we refuse? Daniel asked. Then I make some phone calls, file some reports, and watch federal agents seize everything you own while you're investigated for receiving stolen goods and money laundering. You'll spend years in court, spend millions in legal fees, and ultimately lose anyway. But you'll also lose your reputations, your privacy, and quite possibly your freedom. Eve stared at the woman who was calmly threatening to destroy everything they'd fought to reclaim. Why now? Why wait until after we've already been through hell? Because watching you suffer makes it sweeter, Catherine said with brutal honesty. My father died alone and afraid, tortured by criminals who wanted his money more than they valued his life. I've spent 23 years knowing that one of those criminals was living free, getting rich off stolen art, raising a family with blood money. She gestured at the expensive flowers on their parents' graves, the designer clothes the children wore, the luxury car they'd arrived in. David Williams got to live a full life, love his wife, raise his children, die peacefully surrounded by family. My father got a pipe wrench to the skull and a shallow grave in the woods. So yes, I waited. I waited until you'd reclaimed your inheritance, until you'd felt safe and secure and loved again. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to have everything ripped away by someone who doesn't care about your pain. The cemetery was silent except for the wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic. Eve looked at her brothers, then at their parents' graves, then at the woman who held their future in her hands. How long do we have to decide? 24 hours, Catherine said. Sign over the art collection, or lose everything trying to keep it. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and children. Don't think about running or hiding the assets. I've been preparing for this confrontation for years. There's nowhere you can go that I won't find you, no legal loophole that will save you, no amount of money that will make this problem disappear. Our father loved us, Marcus said suddenly, his 9-year-old voice carrying absolute conviction. Whatever he did before we were born, he loved us. Catherine's expression softened for just a moment, and Eve saw a glimpse of the daughter who'd lost her father to violence and spent decades seeking justice. I'm sure he did, she said quietly. But love doesn't wash away blood. And stolen money doesn't become clean just because it's spent on good intentions. Then she walked away, leaving 4 children standing in a cemetery, surrounded by the graves of parents who'd tried to protect them from a truth that was about to destroy them anyway. As her car disappeared down the winding cemetery road, Eve felt the same hollowness she'd experienced 6 months ago when their uncles had first betrayed them. But this was worse. This time, she understood exactly what they were losing and exactly why they couldn't fight to keep it. What are we going to do? Daniel asked. Eve looked at her brothers, the 3 people who mattered more to her than all the money in the world, and made the only choice she could make. We're going to go home, she said. We're going to spend one last night in our beautiful house, and tomorrow we're going to give Catherine Montgomery what she wants. But why? Marcus asked, tears streaming down his face. Why do we have to give up everything again? Eve knelt down and pulled her youngest brother into her arms, breathing in the scent of his hair and memoizing the weight of him against her chest. Because stolen money never really belongs to you, she said. And because our father would want us to do the right thing, even when it hurts. But as they drove back to their mansion, their last night in paradise before returning to the kind of modest life that $3 million could provide, Eve wondered if doing the right thing would be enough to keep her family together when the whole world learned the truth about David Williams. Some secrets were too big to stay buried forever, and some truths were too terrible to survive intact. This is such a devastating turn. Do you think there's any way the children can overcome this revelation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Eve hadn't slept. She'd spent the entire night sitting in her father's study, surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and the weight of an impossible decision. Catherine Montgomery's ultimatum hung over them like a sword, ready to fall at exactly noon today. Sign over 98% of their inheritance, or lose everything to a federal investigation that would paint their beloved father as a murderer and thief. But as dawn broke through the mansion's tall windows, Eve realized she'd been asking herself the wrong questions all night. Instead of wondering how to save their money, she should have been wondering why Catherine Montgomery was so certain she could destroy them. Instead of panicking about losing their inheritance, she should have been investigating whether Catherine's claims were actually true. And most importantly, instead of accepting that their father was a criminal, she should have been remembering the man who'd raised her to question everything and trust no one until they'd proven themselves worthy. Daniel, she called softly. Her brother appeared in the doorway within seconds, looking as exhausted and hollow-eyed as she felt. I need you to call Thomas Chen. Tell him to bring every piece of documentation about Daddy's art recovery, every legal filing, every communication with the museums and estate. Why? Daniel asked, but he was already reaching for his phone. Because I don't think Catherine Montgomery is telling us the whole truth. Marcus and Jordan wandered into the study as Eve spread out every document they had, creating a timeline that started with their father's alleged involvement in the robbery and ended with Catherine's ultimatum yesterday. What are you looking for? Marcus asked, settling cross-legged on the Persian rug beside Eve's chair. Lies, Eve said simply. Nobody threatens children unless they are desperate. And nobody gets this angry about something that happened 23 years ago unless there's more to the story. Thomas Chen arrived within an hour, accompanied by his entire legal team and carrying boxes of files that had been stored in his firm's secure archives. But it was the expression on his face that told Eve everything she needed to know. You don't believe her either, she said as he set the boxes on the conference table. I've been David Williams' attorney for 23 years, Thomas replied carefully. I've seen every document, overseen every transaction, verified every piece of art that was returned to museums. If your father was a criminal, I would have known. But could you prove it in court? Daniel asked. That's exactly what we're about to find out. For 3 hours, they dissected Catherine Montgomery's claims piece by piece. The crime scene photos were real. The police reports were genuine. David Williams' fingerprints had indeed been found at Harrison Montgomery's house. But they'd been found in areas where a security consultant would naturally leave prints, door handles, alarm panels, the main office where security equipment was monitored. Nothing near the safe that had been cracked, Nothing in the private collection room where the most valuable art had been stored. "Look at this," Daniel said, pointing to a witness statement that had been buried in the middle of Catherine's folder. "This neighbor says she saw 3 men leaving the Montgomery house around the time of the murder. 3 men, not 4. And this," Marcus added, having inherited their father's eye for detail. "The getaway car was described as a blue sedan. But Daddy's work truck was white, and he never owned a blue car." Jordan, quiet as always but observant as a hawk, pointed to something even more damning. "The robbery happened on a Tuesday night. But look, Daddy's work schedule shows he was installing a security system in Savannah that week. He couldn't have been in Atlanta." Thomas Chen was already on his phone, calling investigators and forensics experts and document analysts. But Eve was looking at something else entirely: the dates on Catherine Montgomery's legal documents. "Thomas," she said quietly, "when did Catherine Montgomery first contact your office about the Williams Trust?" He checked his records. "Never. She's had no contact with our firm until yesterday." "Then how did she know about our inheritance? How did she know the specific pieces of art in our trust's collection? How did she know exactly when to approach us?" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "Someone's been feeding her information," Daniel breathed. "Someone who had access to confidential trust documents," Thomas confirmed grimly. "Someone who knew we'd just reclaimed our inheritance from Samuel and Jerome," Eve added. Marcus sat up straighter. "Someone who wanted us to lose everything we'd just gotten back." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Catherine Montgomery wasn't a bereaved daughter seeking justice for her father's murder. She was a weapon being wielded by someone who wanted to destroy the Williams children, someone who'd already tried once and failed. "Samuel and Jerome," Eve said with absolute certainty. "They hired her." Thomas Chen was already pulling up phone records, bank statements, travel itineraries. Within minutes, he had proof. Substantial payments from Samuel Williams to a private investigation firm in Chicago, payments that had been made during the weeks following their confrontation in the conference room. But it was the email trail that sealed their uncle's fate forever. Detailed instructions to locate and contact any possible heirs of Harrison Montgomery. Background information on the Williams Trust's art collection. Strategies for approaching the children when they were most vulnerable, most likely to fold under pressure. And in the final email, sent just 2 days ago, Samuel Williams had written the words that would ensure his own destruction. "Make sure they understand that their father was a killer. Make sure they know that keeping the money makes them complicit in murder. These kids have soft hearts. Guilt will accomplish what legal threats cannot." "They wanted us to give up our inheritance voluntarily," Eve said, her voice deadly calm. "They wanted us to sign it away so they could challenge our abandonment of the trust and claim it for themselves as the next of kin." But Catherine Montgomery doesn't know she's being used, Daniel realized. She really believes our father killed her father. Thomas Chen was still going through documents, but now he was smiling, the kind of smile that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Actually," he said, "I don't think Harrison Montgomery is her father at all." He spread out a series of legal documents that made Eve's head spin: birth certificates, adoption records, DNA analysis, inheritance disputes that went back decades. Catherine Montgomery is the adopted daughter of Harrison Montgomery's business partner, a man named Charles Montgomery, no relation to Harrison despite the shared surname. She's been fighting for years to claim a portion of Harrison Montgomery's estate, arguing that she was essentially his stepdaughter and deserved inheritance rights. But the real Harrison Montgomery never acknowledged her, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his young face. "Because she wasn't his family," Thomas confirmed. "She was the daughter of his business partner who died in a car accident when Catherine was 16. Harrison Montgomery paid for her education, helped her get started in life, but never formally adopted her or included her in his will. So when our uncles contacted her with proof that our father had stolen her inheritance, she saw a chance to finally get the money she's always believed should have been hers," Eve concluded. Jordan spoke up for the first time that morning. "She's not evil. She's just hurt and angry and being used by evil people." Eve looked at her youngest brother with something approaching awe. At 6 years old, Jordan could see the moral complexity that adults often missed. Catherine Montgomery wasn't their enemy. She was another victim of Samuel and Jerome Williams' greed and manipulation. "So what do we do?" Daniel asked. Eve stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had nearly destroyed them and ultimately saved them. In a few hours, Catherine Montgomery would expect them to sign over their inheritance. Samuel and Jerome would expect their scheme to succeed where direct theft had failed. But the Williams children had learned something during their months on the street that their uncles had never understood. Survival wasn't about having money. It was about having each other, having truth, and having the courage to fight for what was right. "We tell Catherine Montgomery the truth," Eve said. "All of it. Who hired her, why they hired her, and what they are really trying to accomplish." "And then?" Marcus asked. Eve's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "Then we let her decide whether she wants to keep being used as a weapon against children, or whether she wants to help us make sure Samuel and Jerome Williams never hurt anyone ever again." "What if she doesn't believe us?" Daniel worried. "Then we lose our inheritance and rebuild our lives with whatever's left," Eve said simply. "But we do it together, with the truth on our side, and that's more than our uncles will ever have." Thomas Chen was already making phone calls, arranging for Catherine Montgomery to be shown the evidence of Samuel and Jerome's manipulation. But Eve was thinking beyond today's confrontation, beyond the money, beyond the immediate crisis. Her father had spent 23 years building a fortune on legitimate business, careful investments, and legal art recovery. Even if some of that fortune had to be returned to address old injustices, even if they lost millions in the process, they would still have enough to take care of each other and help other children who needed advocates. More importantly, they would have their integrity. Their father's true legacy wasn't money. It was the lesson that doing the right thing mattered more than being comfortable, that protecting family meant sometimes sacrificing for family, and that truth had a power that money could never match. The meeting with Catherine Montgomery was scheduled for noon. It was time to find out if the truth really could set them all free. The meeting with Catherine Montgomery was scheduled for noon. It was time to find out if the truth really could set them all free. Catherine Montgomery arrived at the Williams mansion at exactly noon, carrying a leather briefcase that presumably contained the documents that would strip 4 children of their inheritance. She looked confident, almost serene, like someone who'd finally found the justice that had eluded her for decades. But she wasn't prepared for what waited in the mansion's grand library. Instead of 4 defeated children ready to surrender their fortune, she found Eve Williams surrounded by 3 attorneys, 2 FBI agents, and enough evidence to fill a courtroom. Thomas Chen had spent the morning making calls that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement, and the truth about Samuel and Jerome Williams' latest scheme had traveled fast. "Ms. Montgomery," Eve said politely, gesturing to a chair across from the massive oak table where the evidence was laid out like pieces of a puzzle. "Thank you for coming. We have some things to show you." Catherine hesitated, clearly sensing that something had changed since yesterday's cemetery confrontation. "I thought we had an agreement. You sign over the art collection. I don't destroy your family's reputation." "We did have an agreement," Eve confirmed, "based on information you believed to be true. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about our father, about the robbery, about your right to that art collection, what if all of it was a lie?" "I have FBI files," Catherine said, but her voice lacked yesterday's conviction. "You have carefully selected portions of FBI files," Agent Sarah Martinez corrected from her position by the window. "Files that were provided to you by someone with a very specific agenda." Thomas Chen opened the first folder and spread out bank records, email communications, and phone logs that painted a devastating picture. "Ms. Montgomery, you were contacted 3 weeks ago by a private investigation firm in Chicago. That firm was hired by Samuel and Jerome Williams, the same men who stole from their own nephews and nieces." Catherine's face went white. "That's not. They told me they were representatives of a victims' rights organization." "They lied," Daniel said simply. "Just like they've been lying to everyone for 6 months." Agent Martinez stepped forward with her own folder. "Ms. Montgomery, I need you to look at these documents very carefully. This is the complete FBI file on the Harrison Montgomery murder case, not the edited version you were shown." For 20 minutes, Catherine read in absolute silence while the truth demolished everything she'd believed. The timeline that proved David Williams was in Savannah during the robbery. The witness statements that described 3 perpetrators, not 4. The physical evidence that placed the real killers, all of whom had died in a shootout with police, at the scene. But it was the final document that broke her completely. "This is a letter from Harrison Montgomery," Agent Martinez explained gently. "Written 6 months before his death to his attorney, expressing his intention to formally adopt you and include you in his will. He'd planned to surprise you on your college graduation." Catherine's hands shook as she read Harrison Montgomery's own words. "Catherine has been the daughter I never had. When Charles died, I promised him I would take care of her, and I have failed in that promise by not making our relationship official. She deserves to inherit not just my money, but my name and my legacy. I intend to correct this oversight immediately. He was going to adopt you, Eve said softly. You would have been his legal heir, entitled to his entire estate. But he was murdered before he could complete the paperwork. The real killers stole that from you, Marcus added with the brutal honesty that only 9-year-olds could manage. Not our daddy. Our daddy never even met you. Catherine looked up with tears streaming down her face. Then I've spent 23 years hating an innocent man. You've spent 23 years being manipulated by guilty ones, Thomas Chen corrected. Samuel and Jerome Williams found your old legal challenges to the Montgomery estate, realized you still believed David Williams was involved in the robbery, and decided to use your pain as a weapon against his children. Agent Martinez pulled out another set of documents, search warrants, arrest warrants, and federal indictments that would ensure Samuel and Jerome Williams faced justice for conspiracy, fraud, child endangerment, and a dozen other charges. We've been building a case against your uncles since their first theft from the trust, she told the children. But their attempt to use Ms. Montgomery to coerce you into abandoning your inheritance just gave us everything we needed for racketeering charges. What does that mean? Jordan asked in his quiet voice. It means they are going to prison for a very long time, Agent Martinez said with satisfaction. And it means every penny they stole from you will be returned with interest and penalties. But Eve was looking at Catherine Montgomery, seeing not an enemy but another victim of her uncle's greed. What will you do now? Catherine wiped her eyes and managed a shaky smile. I'll sue the private investigation firm that lied to me. I'll pursue the real killer's estates for wrongful death. And I'll try to figure out how to apologize to 4 children for threatening to destroy their lives based on lies. You don't need to apologize, Eve said firmly. You need to help us make sure this never happens to anyone else. What do you mean? Eve stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had tested them, broken them, and ultimately made them stronger. Our father left us more than money. He left us the responsibility to use that money for good. There are other children out there being betrayed by adults they trust, other families being destroyed by greed, other people who need advocates. She turned back to Catherine with a proposal that would change everything. Harrison Montgomery's Foundation for Disadvantaged Youth went dormant after his death because there was no one to run it. You could bring it back to life. We could fund it, you could manage it, and together we could make sure his real legacy lives on. Catherine stared at her for a long moment. You want to give me money? After what I tried to do to you. We want to give you purpose, Daniel corrected. The same way our father found purpose in making things right. Besides, Marcus added with a grin that reminded everyone he was still just a 9-year-old boy. We've got so much money we literally can't spend it all. Might as well use it to help people. Agent Martinez cleared her throat. Speaking of which, we'll need you children to testify when your uncles go to trial. Are you prepared for that? Eve looked at her brothers, seeing the same determination in their faces that had carried them through 6 months on the streets. We've been preparing for that our whole lives. The trial of Samuel and Jerome Williams became a media sensation that dominated Atlanta headlines for 3 months. The story had everything: child endangerment, massive fraud, family betrayal, and 4 orphaned children who'd survived homelessness to reclaim a fortune worth over $150 million. But it was the children's testimony that sealed their uncle's fate. Eve Williams, now 19 and poised beyond her years, calmly recounted 6 months of sleeping in alleys while her uncles lived in luxury purchased with stolen money. Daniel, at 13, methodically presented evidence of their uncle's calculated deception with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. Marcus, still just 10 but no longer the scared child he'd been, made the jury cry when he described going hungry while his uncles ate at expensive restaurants. And Jordan, barely 7 but wise beyond his years, delivered the most devastating testimony of all. They weren't mean to us because they were bad people, he said in his quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. They were bad people because they chose to be mean to us. There's a difference. The verdict was unanimous on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, child endangerment, racketeering, and a dozen other charges that would keep Samuel and Jerome Williams in federal prison for the next 25 years. But the real victory wasn't the guilty verdict. It was what happened afterward. Catherine Montgomery had indeed revived Harrison Montgomery's Youth Foundation, turning it into one of the most effective child advocacy organizations in the Southeast. With unlimited funding from the Williams Trust, the foundation provided legal representation for children in guardianship disputes, emergency housing for families in crisis, and educational support for kids aging out of foster care. The Montgomery Foundation had already helped 43 families avoid the kind of betrayal the Williams children had endured. Rebecca Williams, Samuel's ex-wife, had testified for the prosecution, providing key evidence about her husband's spending habits and suspicious behavior. After the divorce was finalized, she'd used her share of the restitution money to open a shelter for homeless families, specifically focusing on keeping siblings together during crisis situations. "I can't undo what Samuel did," she told Eve during the Foundation's first annual gala, "but I can make sure other families don't suffer the way you did." Even more surprisingly, the Williams children had gained an unexpected ally in their fight for justice. Detective Maria Santos had been so impressed by their resilience and determination that she'd created a special task force dedicated to investigating financial crimes against children. The Williams Protocol, named after the family, had already resulted in 17 arrests and the recovery of over $8 million in stolen assets. But perhaps the most meaningful victory was the smallest one. The storage unit in Decatur, the place where they'd first discovered their father's secret, had been transformed into a memorial library. Every book, every document, every piece of their parents' lives had been preserved there, along with new additions from families who wanted to honor loved ones who'd protected children. It was there, on the second anniversary of their parents' death, that the Williams children held their own private ceremony of remembrance and gratitude. "Mama and Daddy would be proud," Marcus said, placing fresh flowers on the small shrine they'd created. "They are proud," Eve corrected, looking around at everything they'd built from the ashes of their tragedy. "They are watching us prove that love really is stronger than greed, that family really is about choice, and that doing the right thing really does matter more than being comfortable." Daniel, now 15 and already accepted to early admission programs at 3 universities, pulled out a letter he'd been writing. "I've been thinking about what Daddy said in his letter to us. About how being family isn't about sharing blood, it's about choosing to love someone no matter what." He looked around at the group that had gathered for this private ceremony, not just the 4 Williams children, but Catherine Montgomery, Rebecca Williams, Detective Santos, Thomas Chen, and a dozen other people who'd become family through shared purpose rather than shared genetics. Jordan, now 8 and no longer the silent child he'd been during their darkest days, stood up with the confidence that came from knowing he was loved, protected, and valued. "I want to read something too." He pulled out a composition notebook and opened it to a page covered in his careful handwriting. "This is a story I wrote for school. It's called The Treasure Hunt. Once upon a time, there were 4 kids who went looking for treasure. They thought the treasure was gold and jewels and money, but that wasn't the real treasure at all. The real treasure was finding out that they were brave and strong and good at taking care of each other. The kids had to fight pirates who tried to steal their treasure, but the pirates were actually family members who forgot that love is more important than money. The kids won the fight not because they were stronger, but because they told the truth and other good people helped them. At the end of the story, the kids still had lots of gold and jewels and money, but they learned that the real treasure was always each other. And they used the gold to help other kids find their treasure too. The end. Jordan closed the notebook and looked around at his family, blood family and chosen family, people who'd been with them since the beginning and people who'd joined their story along the way. "That's our story," he said simply. "We went looking for money, but we found out we already had everything we needed." Eve felt tears on her cheeks, not from sadness this time, but from overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. They'd lost their parents, their home, their childhood innocence. But they'd gained something more valuable. The knowledge that they could survive anything as long as they had each other, and the power to make sure other children never had to suffer what they'd suffered. Outside the storage unit, Atlanta sparkled in the evening light, full of possibilities they were finally ready to embrace. Inside this small space where their real journey had begun, 4 orphan children had become 4 young people with the resources, the determination, and the family support to change the world. Their father's final gift hadn't just been money. It had been the lesson that inherited wealth paled in comparison to inherited love, and that the greatest treasure any family could possess was the unbreakable bond of choosing each other, again and again, no matter what. Samuel and Jerome Williams had tried to destroy that bond. Instead, they'd only made it stronger. And as the Williams children walked out of the storage unit and into their future, they carried with them the absolute certainty that their parents' love would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, love really was the only inheritance that mattered. And theirs would last forever. 5 years later, Eve Williams graduated summa cum laude from Emory University Law School at 24, immediately joining Thomas Chen's firm as a specialist in family law and children's rights. Her first case resulted in the prosecution of a foster care agency that had been systematically defrauding the state while neglecting the children in their care. Daniel Williams, accepted to MIT at 16, earned dual degrees in computer science and business administration. At 19, he founded a tech company that created software to track and prevent financial crimes against vulnerable populations. The Guardian Protocol system was adopted by Child Protective Services agencies in 37 states. Marcus Williams, now 14, had discovered a gift for public speaking that made him one of the most effective advocates for homeless youth in the country. His testimony before Congress resulted in the passage of the Williams Act, federal legislation that strengthened protections for children in guardianship situations. Jordan Williams, at 12, had quietly become the family's investment genius, managing the trust's portfolio with an intuitive understanding of markets that amazed even seasoned professionals. But more importantly, he'd never lost his gift for seeing the heart of any situation with perfect moral clarity. Together, the Williams children had used their inheritance to help over 2,000 families, prevent dozens of cases of guardianship fraud, and create a network of support systems that ensured no child would ever again face the kind of betrayal they'd endured. Their parents' colonial home in Buckhead, the house Samuel and Jerome had sold for their own profit, was purchased by the Williams Trust and converted into a residential facility for siblings aging out of foster care. The nameplate by the front door read Patricia and David Williams' house, where family begins. And in the master bedroom, where their parents had once planned for their children's futures, a simple plaque bore the words that had become the family motto. Love shared is never divided, only multiplied. Samuel and Jerome Williams were scheduled for release in 2048, when they would be in their 70s. They would emerge from federal prison to find that the children they'd betrayed had become the most powerful advocates for child protection in the Southeast, and that their own names had become synonymous with everything they'd once thought they wanted to be remembered for. But the Williams children had learned something their uncles never would. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents. It was measured in lives changed, families protected, and love that grew stronger with every challenge it faced. And by that measure, they were the richest family in the world. Thank you for following this incredible journey of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of true family. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we choose to give.